Well, now you already heard me rattle on for longer than you wanted to, so I won't even, I don't know what that is. I won't hardly talk at all, just to respond to the excellent things that have already been said. Look, I mentioned earlier, and I think this has been the key thing, the job, there's no one-to-one correlation. If you're hoping that divesting your particular university or anything will have a kind of one-to-one correlation with lowering the temperature of the planet, it won't. This entire task is about changing what I was earlier calling the zeitgeist, and it's been wonderful to watch that start to happen. So you got all the long, and Paul did a good job of providing a long list of numbers about how much carbon we have to keep underground. And the thing is that no one really knew those, like even 3 or 4 years ago. Like, I wrote pretty much the first article that kind of got them out there, and it was in Rolling Stone. It was exactly 3 years ago at the moment. For those of you who keep your back issues, it was the one with Justin Bieber on the cover and his white T-shirt. But this article had that sort of math in it, that we have 5 times as much carbon as we can burn. And because people stood up all over the planet and started saying, those numbers are important, those are we did this tour, we called Do the Math, around many parts of the world to sort of seed this divestment movement. Within 18 months, that math had become the commonplace math of the IMF, of the World Bank, of all of that. It was the perfect example of kind of citizen action driving this stuff into consciousness. And that needs to continue to happen because it needs to continue to get further, deeper into people's consciousness. And one of the ways to do it is we just heard, to understand it also powerfully as a moral issue. Once you know those numbers, it's not all right to invest in this stuff anymore. That is to say, if it's wrong to wreck the planet, then it's wrong to profit from that wreckage, period, end of story, okay? But the good news is that it's only one front in this fight, and it helps open up all these other ones. So for instance, fossil fuel subsidies are a perfect example of a place where we desperately need to be working hard. We've organized as best we can around it, and it's one of these frustrating places where we've actually gotten leaders of the world to agree that theoretically, the G7 has announced that they're all opposed to fossil fuel subsidies and they're going to get rid of them. They just haven't done it yet, and probably won't as long as the power of this industry remains as big as it is. And in Ireland, which doesn't have a huge fossil fuel industry, it may be a little hard to remember just how powerful these guys are. So, for instance, in my country, the richest person on earth is the 2 Koch brothers combined, okay? Together, their net worth is over $100 billion, and it all comes out of oil and gas. They're the biggest leaseholders up in the tar sands in Canada. Well, they've announced that they're going to spend $900 on the next federal election in the United States. That is, they're going to spend more money than the Republican Party or the Democratic Party on the next election. And they're going to do it to make sure that nothing changes. That's why we have to push so hard on the other side. And so all these things are now really starting to come into question in the best possible way. These questions about the shift of exploration capital to low carbon technology, Forrest are exactly right. Exxon alone spends $100 million every single day looking for more hydrocarbons. Think what $100 million a day spent on solar panels would provide. I mean, give it 3 weeks and all of Ireland has a solar panel. Those numbers start to add up fast. The good news is that as this analysis starts to deepen, we're getting a kind of virtuous cycle going here, because it's clear that as people make this argument, it's clear that these stocks are overvalued in some way. If you start to figure in any of that risk of any of those assets being stranded, then these stocks are probably valued at a premium, which means that they're beginning to, in part because of that analysis, beginning to go down. The coal sector has fallen 87% in the last 5 years. It's been the single worst investment you could possibly make. And as that becomes clear, it gets easier and easier to persuade people of all kinds to divest, because one thing that unites investors of all kinds is they dislike losing money. An investment in a fossil-free portfolio over the last 5 years outperformed the market, the broader market, by 120 basis points, which is a lot. I mean, people in the markets kill each other for 6 or 7 basis points. 120 basis points is a lot of money. And so it really is starting to push this system in interesting ways. There are other ways to push it, but this question that's raised of engagement and share action and things are really important to think about, okay? Shareholder engagement is a powerful tool that we've used in a lot of ways, in a lot of different fights over the years, and I've been involved in some of them. Where it works is when the questions at issue are secondary to the central business of the company in question. So, for instance, Apple is paying its workers in China bad slave wages, okay? So we put some pressure on the company, start to make them look bad. They raise the wages of their workers. The price of an iPhone goes up $1. Everybody's happy in the end, okay? It's sort of whatever. That works great as long as, but if the question at issue was we have to get rid of cell phones, then it would not be a useful strategy to go at Apple that way, because they wouldn't do it. The core business of the fossil fuel industry at the moment is digging up stuff and burning it. And they're not going to, and they've refused to. I mean, we've lost for 25 years. People have tried these engagement strategies with them, and it hasn't worked. As one of my colleagues in the States, a guy that Ronald Reagan appointed twice to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, said not long ago, it's like trying to convince Jack Daniels that they don't want to run a distillery anymore. You just can't do it. And so the only way is, at the moment, to try and isolate and turn them into the pariahs that they should be, at which point they'll begin. That's when the bargaining will begin. And you can see it beginning to start to happen. The oil companies, a couple of them this year were saying, maybe a price on carbon isn't the worst idea in the world after all, The kind of bargaining is just beginning. But they've been so powerful for so long that we have to push them a lot harder if we're going to get to any kind of reasonable bargain in the middle. They still hold most of the cards. And the good news is, happily, we're not going to, this is not going to engender a financial crash, because it's not going to happen all at once. In some sense, would that it were, because it might prevent the much larger ecological crash that's now underway, but it's not going to. I mean, the kindest thing one could do to the financial system really is what we're doing at the moment, which is trying to let the air out of this thing, rapidly, but not so rapid, not just letting it move forward until we just reach some cliff where we have to instantly stop what we're doing and shift. So, as always, the tragedy is that we basically knew all this 25 years ago. And had we started then, we'd be way, way along in this transition already. But we didn't start then, and so we're much further out on the limb than is safe. And that was just underlined a couple hours ago when The Lancet, one of the 2 or 3 leading medical journals in the world, published a huge study this morning just saying that climate change is, as we look forward, going to, at current rates, undo all the health gains of the last century. When you think about the fact that we, the sort of human sweat and labor and inspiration and genius that went into those improvements over the last century, and they're the thing that sort of we boast about most when we think about how the world has gotten better, that those are at risk now, you get some sense of the scale that we're up against and the reason that we need to push so hard. The job of activists, I always think, is to push the system as hard as it can and see what happens. You never know exactly what the reaction is going to be and where it's going to go. You just know that left to its own devices, the system just kind of rolls on. And if you push it hard in all kinds of ways, you'll at least have some reaction and something to work with. And that's what we're starting to see now. So it's a really interesting moment. And it would be, universities in this country don't have the same pools of money because you guys are set up differently, and for some reason think that it should be almost a right to get an education and things, and not in our country. But there are other pools of money in Ireland, and in the wake of the papal encyclical last week, it's pretty obvious where some of those efforts should be directed. The Pope understands the deep linkages between markets and where we're going, and why that's one of the places that we need to be pushing. So I just am so grateful for the wisdom up on this panel and for all the people who are pushing hard on this stuff.